Y'all know what time it is. It is the In the Scope podcast with your boy, Joshua M. Hicks, senior writer for War Media. You can check out my Instagram and the Twitter at Josh M. Hicks Media. And man, I got a heck of a show for you guys this go around. I got a great guest. He covers the NBA for Bleacher Report, and he is based in Portland. Portland got a lot of interesting things going on since the offseason when you talk about the team in general. But I got someone here that's going to break all that down for me, as well as the NBA. He is a very known writer for Bleacher Report, covers the NBA. Sean Highkin. Sean, how you doing, my brother?
Doing all right. How about you?
Likewise, man. I really appreciate you getting on my show. Like we talked beforehand, I followed your work, I follow your content, and you put out some really great things out there. And I'm glad to be able to finally see in person, in person, and meet and talk with you about all things NBA, man. It's really truly an honor and a blessing for real.
Yeah, good to be with you.
All right, man. Let's not beat around the bush about it. A couple weeks ago was really interesting for the NBA regarding how people handle themselves in the office. You had the Suns come out with the investigation on Robert Sarver and his accusations, and unfortunately, even for you in Portland, Neil Olshey, I think you're saying his last name, right? Olshey. Yeah. He came, he's under investigation for his activity in the workplace. For me, Sean, for our audience in general, talk about where were you? Like, what was going through your mind when you first heard of the news that Neil Olshey was going to be investigated? Like, what was the first moments like for you?
So it was kind of crazy because that night, it was November 5th was that night. They had it was the first night of a home and home back-to-back. They played the Pacers one night, and then they were going to play the Lakers the next night. And so at the Pacers game, which was the first game, I just saw Neil there pre-game, just kind of hanging out courtside, talking with some staffer from the Pacers, just kind of acting normal. And there was no idea that anything was going on, no rumor of anything or just anything like that. But then, I'm, probably like 10:30, 11 at night, whenever it is, I'm driving home from the game because, after the game, we do all the media stuff and then you write whatever you write. So I'm driving home from the game. And as I'm pulling up, I look at my phone and I see the alert from Shams Charania from The Athletic saying that the Blazers have launched an internal investigation into Neil Olshey's treatment of employees in the workplace. And so I just like, okay, well, that just came out of nowhere. And then from there, it's like, I thought I was going to be able to go to bed a little early that night. It ended up not happening. So I'm like calling, texting people who are trying to figure out what's going on. And then the next day, so they play the Lakers the next night. And it's just kind of a strange atmosphere because nobody really knows what's going on. Neil's obviously not there that night. And people that I like, there are plenty of team staffers and team employees that I'm friendly with and that I normally talk to at games all the time, just like it's nothing. And a lot of people are just kind of keeping their distance because they're not really, they don't want to be seen talking to reporters. It's just a really weird situation. I haven't been back to the practice facility since all of this broke because the Blazers have been on the road a lot during that time. They haven't had a practice. Apparently, this is one of the things that Chris Haynes at Yahoo reported was that Neil has just been at the practice facility, just, doing the job like normal and just being there around people. I'll be interested to see if, he's at the practice tomorrow, but that's kind of where stuff is at right now. We really don't know a whole lot about what's going on.
Yeah, it's really out of the blue, like you mentioned, when that news broke out. And what really went through my mind, because obviously Robert Sarver's situation came up first, and then this happened like a couple of days after, and you're like, man, what's going on in the NBA? But another thought of mine that came about was the fact that Portland just can't get a break, just because this whole offseason you had everything going on with does Damian Lillard want to stay? Is the superstar happy? Is he going to get traded? Right. Is he going to actually stay? But maybe closer towards the deadline, depending on how things go, is he going to want to bounce? There's rumors about CJ McCollum potentially being in trade packages for Ben Simmons. And then not to mention, you just hired your first year head coach at Chauncey Billups, who I believe is a well-respected guy, and I loved seeing him being hired by the Trailblazers, but there's question marks of people who question his coaching ability and the coaching hire, considering, the stagnation of Terry Stotts' era in the playoffs and how Damian Lillard wants to go to that next level. And reportedly, Chauncey Billups was not the first guy on his list. So I just felt like Portland could just not catch a break. And this was like the icing on the cake for them as they're heading into this season.
Well, the problem with the Chauncey Billups hire was kind of the other stuff that, came into it also, because remember, there was that rape allegation from his past as a player that kind of got brought up on social media. That, they got brought up on social media, and then at their introductory press conference, they sort of addressed it, but then they didn't, and then they weren't very transparent about how well they investigated it, and obviously that alienated a lot of people in terms of the fan base and some people who work for the team, and that was definitely a situation of, Neil Olshey was always going to hire Chauncey Billups, and that was his guy. And he basically just dismissed any of these, pretty serious concerns about some of the stuff in his background that, would have stood in the way of him making the hire that he wanted to make. And I think a lot of this is sort of tying into, a lot of bad feelings and not goodwill that has kind of been engendered by some of the stuff that he's done. And then, you add on to it the on-court stuff. Dame was not happy that they lost in the first round to Denver last year when Denver had 2 of their 3 or 4 or whatever best players injured. And there were all the rumors this summer. I don't believe that Dame is still in the place where he's thinking about leaving. I think there was a time this summer when he was maybe looking around, but I think after, he won the gold medal at the Olympics, and then he, got married. And so, he had a lot going on this summer. I think he just kind of cooled off after that. He's been pretty definitive about not wanting to leave Portland since the season started. So I don't think that's really going to be a factor. Obviously, people are still talking about it because people always still talk about that stuff. But there's just a whole lot of stuff up in the air right now. The roster, the team is not that good. They're, basically a 500 team at this point. Whatever is going to end up happening with this Neil Olshey investigation, and I believe that at the end of it, he is going to end up not keeping his job. I don't know when that's going to happen, but I believe that that's going to be the end result of this whole thing. And then, after that, it's once that happens, who do they bring in? Do they bring in a new GM? And then does that GM have different philosophies about which players they want to keep? Or maybe does CJ McCollum, who Neil Olshey has never really had any interest in trading, does he become more available? And then do other things get shaken up? And on top of it, this is the part that I think is, it's pretty well known in Portland, but it's not very well publicized outside of the market. They're just ownership, the organization has completely changed since Paul Allen, who had owned the team since the late 80s, passed away in 2018. His sister Jody is running the team now, and she is pretty Paul Allen was one of the most hands-on owners in the NBA. He would have opinions about players that they should draft, and he was very hands-on in a lot of the basketball stuff, and he really cared about the team, for better or worse, wherever you come down on that. Jody just does not have a lot of interest in basketball, and she's very hands-off. And since she took over when her brother passed away, Neil has basically been able to do whatever he wants, and he hasn't really had anybody checking him. And then you've also got Chris McGowan, the president of business operations, who ran all kind of the marketing stuff. It was pretty separate from the basketball stuff. Just last week, he stepped down, which I think was more of a planned transition. I don't think that was related to the Olshey stuff, but there's just a lot going on all at once. And meanwhile, the team is trying to figure out what they are on the court as a basketball team. And I don't know, it's just a lot to kind of deal with.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned all those different things. And not to mention as well, from an ownership perspective, how vastly different they were. It kind of reminds me in ways of what maybe what the Lakers went through when Dr. Jerry Buss died, and you had Jeannie take that over, and the fight between the brothers and who's hands-on.
The siblings, and then she eventually. Well, the difference between those two situations, though, are that the Buss family, all Jeannie and Jim and all the kids, they all care about basketball. This is their whole family business. Paul Allen wasn't married. He didn't have kids. And so his sister inherited his whole estate because she was the next of kin. And she just she was never involved in any of this stuff at all. So it's not like this is the family business and he's passing it down to his kid or whatever when he passes away. She was just kind of the person that sort of got it by default. And she has not really had a lot of interest in, Paul Allen owned the Seahawks too. And so they're kind of in a similar spot. And the guy who's really calling the shots is Bert Kolde, who is the vice chairman of Vulcan Sports, which is the company that Paul Allen ran the Blazers and the Seahawks. And he's based in Seattle. He's a lot more of a football guy than a basketball guy. He's a lot more hands-on with the Seahawks than he is with the Blazers. And so you just kind of have this environment where nobody, like, because the business ops stuff and the basketball ops stuff was so separate and the ownership at this point isn't really hands-on with anything. You have, a situation where Neil Olshey basically doesn't answer to anybody. And that's how you get to where, they fire Terry Stotts and he goes on a press conference and says that the 29th defensive rating and the first round exit were not a product of the roster and basically keeps the roster the exact same. And then he hires the coach that he wants to hire and basically does a fake coaching search where they leak that Becky Hammond is a finalist because that's good PR. And like Mike D'Antoni was supposedly in the mix, but he wasn't really in the mix. And Neil was always going to hire Chauncey Billups. And then they completely blew past this allegation about Chauncey Billups that had been out there and didn't really take that as seriously as some people would have liked for them to take. And just, there's been nobody there to say, hey, Neil, you can't do this. And then now we're kind of hearing about, and to be honest, this stuff, as somebody who's dealt with Neil and as somebody who's, been around the team for a long time, the stuff that we're hearing, we don't know what the specific complaint was about, what led to this investigation, who filed the complaint, what the thing that he was accused of doing is. We don't know any of that stuff. That stuff's all been pretty under wraps, but just generally the idea that Neil is kind of fostering a culture in the office with the Blazers where he's just not a very pleasant person to work for or work with. And he'll just like seek out low-level staffers and like berate them, totally out of proportion for whatever, and basically just make people afraid to come to work. That's something that anybody who's, around this team, it's not that hard for anybody to believe. My thing with this whole investigation and the timing of it, because, of the stuff that I said about, how hands-off ownership is, I'm not sure I necessarily believe that they suddenly are starting to really care about, the workplace environment of the Blazers. I think a lot of this, and this is something that was kind of alluded to in the report from Woj today, that the general managers are trying to form a union to protect themselves against this kind of stuff. But it seems to me, and I've been at every Blazers home game so far this season, and the Blazers usually have one of the best home crowds in the league. The building is packed, all of that. Great fans, great atmosphere, all that. None of these games, even when it's a team like the Lakers that were in town earlier this month, none of those games have been even close to sold out. And so my working theory this entire time has been that ticket sales are starting to slip. And now suddenly ownership is looking around like, hey, wait a minute, what's going on here? How are we going to be able to save some money? And so then one easy way to do that, and also to, get some, good PR and goodwill, is you launch this investigation. You try to find some stuff on Neil Olshey in order to be able to fire him for cause, because if they just fired him because they thought he wasn't a very good GM or whatever, they would still have to pay him out on his contract. And I don't know exactly how much money he makes, but he's one of the most highly paid front office executives in the league from everything that I understand. So if they can find a way to fire him for cause or fire him for like violating some conduct rule or something, then they can void his contract and get out of paying him. And that's a way of saving some money and also firing a guy who is pretty unpopular, both in the organization and in the fan base, which would create some goodwill. So it's just, I think he's going to end up being gone eventually. It's just a matter of whether they can come up with enough cause to fire him and get out of paying him, or if he's going to be able to fight to keep his money, or they're going to do some sort of buyout agreement or something to that. I don't know. There's a whole lot that kind of still has to be resolved, but I do believe that eventually he's not going to be the general manager of the Portland Trail Blazers anymore when this is all over.
Yeah, that's a lot of dominoes that are falling into the fact that
absolutely
that you definitely have to manage. But you briefly talked about how the public eye had their look of disarray in a sense for Chauncey Billups taking that head coach position.
Yeah,
I want to allude to this narrative of privilege and coach from a coach's perspective, because if you want to talk about rape allegations or allegations of misconduct
Sure.
that have been plagued on not just players but coaches as well when it comes to hiring positions, someone that comes to my mind when you bring up that discussion is like a Jason Kidd, who had his DUI situation, and from what I've heard, actually stopped him from getting a head coaching job with the Lakers, which made them bring Frank Vogel in and have him become an assistant. But now he's in Dallas, and that wasn't much of a flag.
Well, Jason Kidd also had some domestic abuse stuff that he actually was convicted of. Like I think the difference, and I understand like why you would kind of bring that up, because Jason Kidd, I don't think he was ever a real candidate for the Blazers job, but he was the guy that Dame came out and said he wanted. But the difference between the two situations is that Jason Kidd's stuff, like, all that stuff, the domestic abuse stuff, the DUI thing that happened when he first took the Brooklyn job in 2013, that stuff is all out there. Everybody knows about that stuff. I'm, somebody like me whose job it is to, be immersed in this stuff 24 hours a day, all this stuff. I had no idea about this old allegation from about Chauncey Billups until like in May or so, when his name first started coming up as being a candidate for some of these head coaching jobs. It happened, or the alleged incident happened, and the complaint was filed in 1997. He settled out of court in 2000. That was very early in his playing career. And, to be honest with you, I said this at the time when this was going on. I'm not super interested in litigating this thing from 25 years ago and deciding whether I think that Chauncey Billups did or didn't do this thing that he was accused of. I don't think that's really worthwhile or productive. And I don't really think it's our place to say, hey, anybody who's ever been accused of anything should never be able to have a head coaching job. I don't know if it's necessarily our place to say that.
Right.
My issue with the way the process was handled was that Neil Olshey had his guy that he wanted the entire time. And that was basically going back to before Neil took the Blazers job, he was the GM of the Clippers. And Chauncey Billups was playing for the Clippers at the time, kind of near the end of his career when they first traded for Chris Paul from New Orleans. They brought Chauncey in to be his backup. And so he and Neil have a relationship going back 10 years. And so Neil basically knew who he was going to hire the whole time. What I didn't think was great about the way the process was handled was they basically ran a fake coaching search and basically said, I mean, back in, you're based in Chicago. You do a lot of Bulls stuff, I assume. I'm not sure if you were around or you remember this, but about 5 or 6 years ago, when the Bulls fired Tom Thibodeau, this is when I was still covering the Bulls. This is when I was still on the beat.
Yep.
I remember sitting there at the press conference with Gar Forman and John Paxson when they announced that they had fired Tom. And they said, we're going to undertake a wide-ranging coaching search and leave no stone unturned. And we're going to interview a wide variety of candidates. And then, 48 hours later, like the years and money on Fred Hoiberg's contract were being reported. And it was all just, because, Fred Hoiberg played at Iowa State when Gar Forman was an assistant coach there. It was kind of a similar thing with Neil and Chauncey, where they had this relationship going back to the Clippers. That was always the guy that he was going to hire. And honestly, if this allegation from his past didn't exist, I don't think anybody would have had an issue with the hire. There's plenty of, you look at how well respected Chauncey was as a player in terms of as a leader, as a point guard, as a finals MVP. Right. His playing career speaks for itself, obviously. There's plenty of reason. And and now having dealt with him for the first couple months of the season personally, I find him to be very engaging, very thoughtful, very easy to talk to. I very much enjoyed interacting with him and getting to know him. And, I think there's a lot of reason to believe he's going to end up being a pretty good head coach. It's more so that this allegation existed. They didn't actually investigate it. If they had actually run an investigation and said, okay, we really investigated this and this is what we did. And remember, like at that press conference when they introduced him right after the hire was announced, some people, and I was one of the people at the press conference who asked Neil just point blank, what did you do for this investigation? What firm did you hire? Who did you talk to? What did they tell you specifically that made you comfortable with going forward with the hire? And Neil had that famous line, well, that's proprietary, Sean. You're just going to have to take our word for it. Like That was like a clip that went viral. And then it comes out a couple weeks later, OPB, which is a public radio station here in Portland, and then also Defector, had reports and reached out to different people that the Blazers, they basically just contacted the district attorney in Massachusetts where the case was filed. And the district attorney said, well, I don't think he did it. And they never reached out to the accuser. They never reached out to the accuser's attorney. And then the private investigator that they hired, then somebody found this investigator's Twitter account, and there was like some porn stuff on it. There was some retweets of like some Proud Boy stuff on it. And it was just the whole thing, just the issue that people had with the hire. I don't think a lot of it was even really about Chauncey, because like I said, nobody really knows what did or didn't happen this night where he was accused of doing this thing 25 years ago. And we're never going to know that. The issue that I think a lot of people more so had with it were that Neil Olshey basically just, and this is, emblematic of kind of what's going on now with the investigation, where he basically just gets to do whatever he wants and treat people however he wants and not have any kind of accountability for anything. He had the guy he wanted to hire. There was this serious allegation that should be more of a red flag. Neil just kind of brushed past it and then lied about it and wasn't transparent about how they investigated it. So I think that's it's all, not that this was like necessarily, not that like the current investigation with Neil is at all related to the Chauncey stuff. Right. It's more so just, this is just kind of how he is. And this is kind of how he's been since Paul Allen passed away, where he basically just gets to do whatever he wants and everybody's just kind of afraid to question him on anything. And like I said, my belief is that now that team is starting to lose money on ticket sales and a lot of people are unhappy with the TV deal that they just signed and all this other stuff, like now they're kind of looking for ways to save money. And it just so happens that Neil Olshey is very unpopular and makes a lot of money. And if they can find a way to fire him for cause and save some of that money, that's kind of why I feel like they are where they are right
now. Whew, that's crazy.
it's a lot. There's a lot going on.
Yeah, it definitely is. But I'm glad that one of the people that's closest to the situation come on the show and explain this for us. That's why I got you here. Everybody listening right now, you are listening to Sean Highkin of Bleacher NBA writer, insider for Bleacher Report. Sean, you talked about how obviously ticket sales and how everything's going south for the Portland Trailblazers right now.
Yeah.
You know very well in Chicago, we had the same thing with Gar Forman and John Paxson.
I was there for like a lot of it. Yeah.
Yep. So when you talk about the correlation between the Trailblazers and the Bulls, they recently just played last night. We recorded on a Thursday. They played Wednesday night. And that was a heck of a game, to say the least. Because the beginning of it, to me, it seemed like Portland just wasn't there. They were very, lackadaisical. They weren't interested. And then the Bulls just relaxed in the second half. And Portland goes on this surge. And, next thing you know, they come out and win this game. And I looked at the game as like, okay, the Bulls just got in over their heads. They just thought it was going to be an easy win. They tried to coast, and then it just became a debacle of a show, especially in the closing minutes of the fourth quarter. But then I'm also sitting there like, with Portland being the up and down team that they've been so far this season, could this be a statement win for them to help get them back on track with everything going on? Like that's where my mindset really has been with this game, honestly, as someone that, like you said, looks at, covers Bulls, things of that sort. That Bulls game was just a wreck for us. But from a Portland's perspective, talk about what that game really meant for them and what was your analysis of it?
Well, it's this whole hopes. They started because they beat Toronto on Monday. And then they have this, they're down 20. They look completely disengaged, like you said. They look like they didn't want to be there. And then they have this huge comeback. And in the midst of all of this stuff going on, organizationally and off the court, and even sort of on the court, because Damian Lillard has been kind of up and down shooting. He's been better lately, but he's had some rough shooting nights so far. There's clearly this ab thing that he's been dealing with still, that he's been dealing with at least since the summer, that he was dealing with in the Olympics. So there's still a lot that they have to figure out on the court, but there are some signs that there are some encouraging signs, I think, for some of where this Blazers team is headed. A couple of their young guys, Anthony Simons and Nasir Little, have started to play really well off the bench. And they've kind of, it's interesting because they've stumbled into this kind of thing with these closing lineups the last couple of games with Larry Nance Jr. kind of playing a small ball five and kind of closing with that as opposed to with Yusuf Nurkic. And that's kind of a whole interesting thing because Nurkic has still been very off and on in terms of how productive he is on any given night. And he's in the last year of his contract. And so that's going to be a whole thing they're going to have to figure out. CJ McCollum has been playing pretty well. And, who knows whether that means, depending on who the general manager is, whether that, Neil Olshey has never really shown any interest in trading CJ, but whoever they bring in once this investigation gets, wrapped up, then maybe that person wants to trade CJ and maybe CJ has like upped his trade value with how he's been playing. There's still just a whole lot kind of up in the air. I think ultimately the Blazers with this current roster, who knows again what they're going to do once this GM stuff is figured out. I feel like they are about where they were last year. I think they're a playoff team, but they're like a low seed, like a 6, 7, 8 type of seed, probably lose in the first round again. This is, again, assuming they keep the roster the exact same. They don't trade CJ. They don't trade Nurkic. I think they just kind of are what they are in terms of where they stack up in the West. I don't think they're on the level of, obviously the Warriors are kind of head and shoulders above everybody right now. I don't think they're on the level of like Utah or Phoenix or Denver if they get Jamal Murray back healthy at some point this season. I think Portland is a cut below those teams. And so I think they're still kind of in that same range that they were last season. And, again, who knows, like, again, how is the GM stuff going to play out? The person that they bring in to replace, I have a few ideas of who, I've heard they might bring in, but like who they might bring in, what that person does. Maybe they do the CJ for Ben Simmons trade at that point, who knows? Maybe that shakes some things up. And then maybe Dame gets over this early season slump that he has. And maybe they go on a run. I don't know, but like, I think they are about where they were last year. Now the Bulls, on the other hand, obviously, they lost that game last night. They blew a huge lead. That's never really what you want to see. But they've been one of my favorite teams to watch this season. I've loved the way that Lonzo has fit in next to LaVine. DeRozan has just been awesome. And, even though they lost that game last night, I was really impressed at how they handled both of the LA teams with no Vucevic. Because, with Vucevic out, you don't really have anybody size-wise to match up against Anthony Davis. And they were still able to kind of take him out of the game. He literally got ejected in that game. But then, I think the Caruso signing has been huge for them. He's what he does defensively and, with rebounding and just the way he kind of pesters people. I like this team. I think they're legit. I think they're, I don't think they're on the level of like assuming they figure it out eventually, like the Bucks or the Nets, but I think they are one of the more impressive teams in the East. I think they could easily get to the second or third round, depending on the kind of matchup that they get.
Yeah, I agree. I was one of the few people. I'm not trying to throw shade at anybody, but somebody from Bleacher Report said that that was the worst. DeMar DeRozan coming to the Bulls was the worst signing of the offseason.
Yeah, that was certainly not me. Here's my thing with it. Like, I don't understand. I still follow a lot of Bulls stuff, and even like locally, I feel like a lot of people were mixed about the offseason that they had. My whole thing was I covered the Garpax era where they basically would never go for anything big because they just would, we don't want to mess up our salary cap flexibility. And then they had the 1 year where like they signed Rondo and Wade, and they basically just signed Wade because he was a big name and I thought they could sell some jerseys. And then that didn't work out, and they threw their hands up. We're like, well, I guess you just can't build around Jimmy Butler, and then traded him. And now you look at what he's done in, Philly and Miami and, all that stuff. So now you get you get a real front office, you get a real coach in there after like all the Jim Boylan stuff. And now they're actually trying to spend money on good players, which and people were mad about it. Like I just, first, like they go all in to do the Vucevic trade. And, there were people arguing about like, oh, do they give up too many picks for Vucevic? Is he really that good? Whatever. To me, the point of that trade was sending the message to the rest of the league that we're the Bulls. We're a big market team. We're actually going to take swings and try to get big guys. And then they go out and they spend money on Lonzo Ball, and they go spend money on DeMar DeRozan. I'll tell you, the last trip that I took before the pandemic was to Chicago in February of 2020 for the All-Star game. Mm-hmm. And it was a great event. Like the league did a really good job putting it on. The city did a really good job putting it on. It was really cool. Like I had a lot of fun there. I saw a lot of NBA people, but there was absolutely no buzz at all locally about the Bulls. Nobody was even talking about, oh, people are excited about the Bulls, or like there was no Bulls representation at the all. Like Zach LaVine was in the 3-point contest, and that was about it. Like nobody was taught. Like it was a great, like, oh, this is great. Chicago is putting on for the NBA, but no, and like as a city, like that was what people were talking about. Nobody was talking about the Bulls. And when you're the Bulls and you have the Michael Jordan history, you should be thinking about yourself like you're the Knicks or you're the Lakers or you're some of these, or the Warriors or some of these other teams that are big market teams with history and act like it. And the Bulls under Garpax were never doing that. And then I think that was a big part of, once COVID shut the season down, that was, I think, a big part of just the embarrassment of having all of this, having the whole league in Chicago and nobody really talking about the Bulls. I think the embarrassment of that was part of what eventually led the Reinsdorfs to say, okay, we need to actually like get serious and shake things up and hire Arturas Karnisovas and Mark Eversley and get rid of Jim Boylan and bring in Billy Donovan. And then they basically have empowered them to say, okay, we're going to act like a big market team now. We're going to act like, the Lakers or the Warriors and actually go out and try to get big name guys. We're going to spend money on Lonzo Ball. We're going to spend money on DeMar DeRozan. And so far it's worked out great. The on-court fit has been great. I mean, the thing about DeRozan, and I understand where some of the fit concerns were coming from because he isn't a 3-point shooter, and there's kind of a tendency now for people to just assume that if somebody isn't a good 3-point shooter as a guard or a wing, that they're just not a good basketball player, or that they don't fit in this the modern NBA, whatever the case may be. The thing that really always made sense to me about the DeRozan thing is if you look at the Bulls last season, kind of near the end of the year, they were still kind of in the mix for one of those last few playoff spots or play-in spots. And then Zach LaVine gets COVID and goes out for a couple of weeks, and it's just a wrap for them because they have nobody else that can create their own shot or, get a bucket or create offense or anything. Yep. So now, if Zach is having an off night or Zach isn't shooting well or Zach gets hurt or whatever, something like that happens, they have another guy that you can kind of put the ball in his hands and say, go get us a bucket. And they just didn't have that last year.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I think what got it for me when they made that deal was their games can translate very well. Zach has grown to be a 3-level scorer. He can score pretty much from anywhere at any time with the green light that he has for that team. Yeah. But DeMar DeRozan's game as a mid-range assassin and Billy Donovan's offense, I think that's what really sets it apart. Where Zach LaVine, he can get what he wants, but that he'll make threes too, regardless. He shot it at a crazy efficient rate last year.
And the other part of it too is that a lot of people don't know this because not a lot of people were really watching the post-Kawhi Spurs. Like that was just not something that not a team that I think a lot of people were really watching unless they're Spurs fans because like they weren't really in the playoff mix. They weren't like on national TV, whatever. DeMar DeRozan had, since he left Toronto and went to San Antonio, DeMar DeRozan has gotten so much better as a passer and as a playmaker. And because remember when he was in Toronto, he kind of had that reputation as, oh, he's just a gunner. He's just a volume shooter. He's just a kind of a black hole. He's not really like a team player or a winning player. He kind of had that reputation. He completely flipped that around in San Antonio. And so you have him and Lonzo, who are both completely unselfish passers now, who can also score and, get their own offense, alongside LaVine, who's become such a great shooter. And I think LaVine has also gotten a lot better defensively, or at least the effort I think has been there more. And then you combine that with, Caruso is one of the, Caruso and Lonzo together just kind of smother people defensively on the wing. And, then you have a big like Vucevic, he's obviously injured right now, but a guy like Vucevic, who when he's healthy, he's a big man who can pass and shoot threes too. Like it's just a lot of stuff that just kind of makes sense. And then you even have like a guy like Ayo Dosunmu, who was a 2nd-round pick. I don't think anybody really expected him to contribute, but he's playing real minutes as a rookie. And, even some of these guys like Alize Johnson and who's the Javonte Green, like they have these guys, like these other guys who are kind of getting minutes. Kobe White just came back into the lineup and has just been playing the last couple of games. And I don't know. I think the Bulls kind of have something interesting going here. And are they a title contender this year? No, but after where the Bulls have been the last 4 or 5 years since the Jimmy Butler trade, since they went into this rebuild, you kind of have to get respectable before you can really get into, it's kind of where the Knicks are right now. Like the Knicks have been a joke for so long. They hire Tibbs, they bring in some of these guys that they bring in. Now the Knicks are a playoff team and they're not a joke anymore. And they're just actually a respectable franchise. And so then the next time one of these big name guys is a free agent, the Knicks are maybe a team that he would look at because they look at it and say, oh, this is a legit team with with a good coach and they have a good roster. And it's not just the market that they can sell. I think the Bulls are kind of in that same spot where you can't go from being a terrible team and being out of the playoffs for 4 or 5 years in a row to being a title contender overnight, unless you're the Lakers and LeBron just decides he wants to go there one day. And then also gets Anthony Davis to force a trade there. If you're the Bulls, you have to send the message to the league that you're willing to spend money on big names, and you have to be, we're trying to be good, we're trying to compete, we're trying to be respectable. And then now the league is looking at the Bulls a lot differently than they were looking at them a couple of years ago when the old front office was there, as just kind of, yes, they're in Chicago, yes, it's Michael Jordan's old team, but we're not really taking them seriously because they don't really take themselves that seriously as a big market team. The way that they've approached it with the new front office has been completely different.
Yeah, that's music to my ears, man. We've been saying that for the longest, and I'm glad that someone who actually covered that guard pass or understands and can relate to the audience, like how bad it really was. I mean, anytime you got fans going on national television during All-Star weekend and talk about fire guard packs on TV.
Yeah, that's
the TNT crew. Like
it's
that's
just
how you
rough
know
for the league. It's not great.
No, not great at all. But unfortunately, at least in your situation, and maybe for the league in general, Portland is slowly but surely transitioning to that phase. And Portland, when you talked about how depending on who, what happens with Neil Olshey and who they bring in to replace him, which I do want your opinion on who you've heard who they might replace him with if it gets to that. But let's just say this person is willing to get rid of CJ. Or maybe want to have that conversation with Damian Lillard. I feel like this may turn into what Toronto did with DeRozan, where they just knew even though there was rumblings about they may keep the two or they may give it at least one more year. That the GM might pull the trigger that one time just to break up that dynamic backcourt that they had because they knew they had to make some type of move to get to where they're trying to go to. And for Toronto, paid off. You got Kawhi and you end up winning a championship. So with Portland, I'm not saying they'll win a championship because the West is so loaded now.
Right.
And the East has gotten that much better. Do you really think that maybe the best thing for Portland is to get rid of one of those two players, whether it's Damian or CJ, especially since you're really going to be in a tight pickle because even though Damian wants to say he has expressed frustration, so maybe it may be best for him to go. And then you do have CJ, where I'm pretty sure he doesn't want to go anywhere. When I talked to him on All-Star Weekend, he was highly respectful and in love with the Trailblazers and Damian Lillard and what's going on over there. But contract-wise and what he brings to the table, and maybe even fit sometimes for the teams, like you mentioned, a trade, swapping him with Ben Simmons may be ideal. How do you think, or what do you think could potentially happen with that dynamic backcourt in general? Especially if they ride it out this year and they still, like you said, stay in the same place as they were last year from a successful rate perspective.
Well, I don't think that the idea of trading Dame is at all realistic, unless he outright goes to them and says, I want to leave now, like trade me. Like that's the only way I would even see that being something like that's, it's not, I don't see it being the kind of situation where that would be something they would do if he didn't actively ask for it. I mean, this is all assuming that Neil Olshey is not the one making these calls, because if Neil is still here and he's the one still deciding this stuff, then neither of them are going to get traded. Because I mean, so here's the other thing that I think a lot of people who are out of market, aren't really, in tune with. So Neil Olshey took the job as GM of the Blazers in early June of 2012. So technically he made the final call to draft Dame, but the organization and the front office that was already there had already done a lot of the work on Dame in terms of scouting him and vetting him and doing the intel and stuff. And Paul Allen was already basically decided, like, this is our, like he had dinner with Paul Allen, like during pre-draft workouts Dame did, and just completely blew him away. I mean, as you know, obviously Dame is like one of the most, well-liked guys in the league. You could imagine, like, he has dinner with the owner and the owner comes away saying, this is our guy, this is our next franchise player. The organization had already basically decided Dame is our guy before Neil got there. And so Neil gets credit for drafting Dame, but Dame wasn't like, it wasn't like Neil was the guy that was leading the charge to draft Dame. CJ, on the other hand, came a year later. CJ was Neil's discovery. Neil can take credit for CJ. And because of that, I think more than anything else, Neil has been very hesitant to even entertain the idea of trading CJ because CJ is his kind of crown jewel as a GM and as a draft scout, the guy that he can really take credit for and say, this is my guy. This is the guy I discovered. Now, I think if you take it like from the outside, and especially now that, what was the big move that the Blazers made in the past year? They traded for Norm Powell at the deadline, who's another 6'3" guard, and then they gave him $90 million to re-sign. And so now you're paying Dame, CJ, and Norm, you're paying all of those guys upwards of $20 million a year. You're paying Norm like upwards of 20. You're paying CJ upwards of 30. You're paying Dame upwards of 40. You're probably going to have to pay Anthony Simons, who's another guy that Neil drafted and is very high on and has been pretty good this year. You're going to probably have to pay him like 15 or 17 a year this summer. And he's another, small guard. Like something has to give at some point. And the obvious thing to do, because look, you can't trade Dame just because of what he's meant to the city, what he's meant for the franchise. Like that's the kind of guy that, like, if you can at all help it, you want, even if they never win a championship, you want him to be your Reggie Miller in Indiana, or you want him to be your John Stockton in Utah, where he's the guy that plays his entire career for one team and you retire his jersey and, what he is in the community and all this. That's just not something you do. The obvious thing to do is to trade CJ, whether it be for Ben Simmons or whether it be for maybe not a 1-for-1, but like a couple of pieces, maybe two guys who make like slightly less money that, where you can swap the contract to make the money work, bring in some depth. I don't know. Like there's moves to make if you're a GM that isn't as attached to CJ as Neil Olshey is, which is why I think when whoever ends up replacing him, if the investigation goes the way that I think it will happens, I think you're going to maybe see a different approach as far as that, because I also know that kind of Chauncey Billups, and for as much as like Chauncey's going to pay lip service to, how great it is to have this great backcourt and all of this, you read between the lines of some of the stuff that Chauncey said. Like before the Toronto game, somebody asked him about playing Dame, CJ, and Norm together, and he basically said, yeah, we give up size every night. I think Chauncey knows that all of those guys together is not really sustainable, but he's just the coach. He's not the GM. There's not really anything he can do about it. So I think there are people in the organization who think that that's the way to go, is, breaking them up and you move CJ for something. But it's just, there's no way to really know how that's going to play out until you see how this investigation plays out and what ends up happening with the, with the front office and who ends up taking Neil's spot if Neil does end up getting pushed out.
Yeah, that's very interesting how that dynamic could potentially work out. And you briefly mentioned that, you've heard rumblings about who could potentially be replacements to Neil Olshey if he really is fired or replaced or, relieved of his duties in Portland. Who are those? If you can, tell us who those candidates can be. And ideally, out of those candidates, if you were in those shoes, maybe who would you really choose?
Well, I don't think there's anybody in-house who is like permanent. Like, I mean, because, in other situations, there's been, when there's been turnover in the front office, there's been like a clear number two guy. Like when Daryl Morey left Houston, Raphael Stone immediately, like he was the number two and he had been kind of getting groomed to be the, eventually be a GM. And so it was just obvious for him to slide in. And then when Dennis Lindsay kind of stepped away in Utah, Justin Zanuck was immediately there to kind of take the reins, and he was already there. There's not really anybody in Portland who is like Neil's number two that's like clearly the next guy. Like it's basically just been Neil's show the whole time. I believe that if we were to go down this way, I think that Joe Cronin, who's been there for a long time, he's been there longer than Neil, but he's just kind of their salary cap guy. And just like, if you need a guy to just sort of be your interim for a few months and just kind of be able to make trades and talk to other teams and, just deal with stuff, he can get the job done. I don't think he's a candidate to really be the guy long-term. A couple of names that I've heard as potential candidates, and this is just, none of this is close, or none of this is like, this is just like people that I've heard floated as possibilities. I'm couching this, like I'm doing the Brian Windhorst, don't aggregate this thing. but Chad Buchanan, who has a history with the Blazers organization. He was Kevin Pritchard's number two back in the day. And then he was their de facto GM that year after they fired Rich Cho, where they didn't have a GM. He was one of the guys who really scouted Dame and did a lot of the work on Dame before Neil got there. And then he ended up leaving, and he's Kevin Pritchard's number 2 again in Indiana. And there just seems like there might be some shakeup with Indy at some point. I've heard Chad Buchanan's name as a guy that may be in the mix to come back. And he's obviously a guy that the Vulcans at the organization are all familiar with. So that's one possibility. Another possibility, and I think this one's a little bit more interesting, is Tayshaun Prince, who is currently I believe his title is something like VP of basketball affairs in Memphis. So he's not the GM of the Grizzlies, but he has a title in the front office. He's, he was a GM of a G League team for a while. He's worked his way up kind of since he retired from playing. He's kind of gone, some ex-players go the coaching route. He's kind of gone more the front office route. So he worked his way up, like he was a scout for a while. And now he's kind of worked his way up in there. He's very well liked. I've heard nothing but good things about him from people who have worked with him in Memphis. And obviously he and Chauncey were teammates on that 2004 Pistons team that won the title. And so that would be a guy that you bring in. You don't have to worry about him wanting to bring in his own coach, because obviously he and Chauncey are tight because they played together in Detroit. So that's going to kind of solidify Chauncey's position. And then you just kind of have a different approach. I mean, you look at, I know that a lot of front offices have kind of gone the way of when it comes to hiring these GMs, a lot of them will hire like kind of these, Harvard guys, or like these, these stats guys, or, in the case of a guy like Neil Olshey, who started out as like a player development guy and then was an agent for a while. And then a couple of other teams have former agents like Leon Rose with the Knicks, or Rob Pelinka with the Lakers, or Bob Myers with the Warriors. But some teams, like you look at the Suns, James Jones, former player, worked his way up in the front office, eventually became the GM, and he built a team that went to the finals. I think if you were to bring in a guy like Tayshaun Prince, you kind of would look at that blueprint and say, hey, we're not just going to go with another, guy from the Neil Olshey archetype. We're going to go with a former player who maybe has a different perspective about how to build teams, and also somebody who has a relationship with the coach who's already there because they played together and won a championship together. And so they're probably on the same page about a lot of this stuff. So those would be the two guys that I would say. Chad Buchanan and Tayshaun Prince are the two that I would say are, if I were telling you that, like, my guess as to who it's going to be one of those two. I don't know who or when or how or what or whatever, but those would be the two names I would tell you to keep an eye on.
Tayshaun Prince is interesting. I like that. I like that idea, that potential connection for Portland. And not to mention, like you said, he does give a different perspective. And I think actually he would relate a lot with Damian Lillard. And how they can move that thing, how they can change direction, move things.
Because what was the whole deal? that Detroit team gets talked about as like they were the team that didn't have like 5 superstars, but they won a championship, and like And I think it's because the thing with all the Dame stuff, and I understand why the Dame talk hasn't fully gone away, even though he's shut it down, because I understand that there is just this news cycle of like, who's the next guy that's going to ask for a trade? Who's the next guy that's going to add? Like, I think people were hoping that it was going to be Giannis, but then he signed the extension. So that's off the table. And now people kind of made Dame the next logical guy. I think that Dame, and this is just, I'm not like friends with Dame like some other reporters are, but like, I know Dame well enough. I kind of know sort of how he operates. I think that Dame really does want deep down to play his entire career in Portland, but he wants to do that if he has a chance to win. It's not even like, I don't even think it's a situation where I have to win a championship or else like my career is a failure. I think if it was a situation like, and I mentioned a few other guys who never won a title and played their whole careers with one team, if his career ends up being like Reggie Miller in Indiana or John Stockton in Utah, where you never end up winning the title, but they went to the finals a bunch of times. They were in the conference finals. They were just like, they were always in the mix and they had a shot every year. I think Dame could live with that. What he doesn't want to be is Kevin Garnett in Minnesota, where he had this incredible like Hall of Fame career. He was an MVP candidate every year, and they never even got close. Like the Blazers and Garnett's Timberwolves have made the conference finals the same amount of times, and they were never really a serious contender even that year. The Blazers made the conference finals in 2019. They got swept by the Warriors without Kevin Durant. And that was the closest that they've gotten. So like, I think Dame, he isn't like, I don't think this is, oh, Dame wants to leave. He wants to go to a bigger market. He wants to go to New York or LA because there are more endorsement opportunities or any of this other stuff. And the other part of it is like, even if he wanted to leave, and he has said pretty definitively since training camp started, I'm not leaving Portland. I want to stay in Portland. He said that. The other thing about it is, let's say he does eventually decide like, okay, I want to leave. Where is there really for him to go? There's not a James Harden going to Brooklyn type of situation where you've got two other superstars and everybody just knows that, you can just plug them in there and they're going to dominate. There's no situation like that. Philly is a team that gets talked about a lot, but okay, what if, let's say he goes to Philly, like who knows if Joel Embiid is going to be able to stay healthy for a whole season. That's always going to be a big concern for them. He goes to New York, which again, because the Knicks are good again, like now they're the team that everybody talks about is, oh, maybe they're going to be in the mix for every one of these stars that maybe wants to leave, whatever. That would be a situation, I think, though, where it would be like a Carmelo situation again, where the Knicks gave up so much to get Carmelo that they didn't have enough around him to contend. And I think, the Knicks would have to do the same thing to get Dame, just hypothetically. So I don't think there's a situation out there, even if Dame decided he wanted to leave, which again, he does not. And he's made very clear that he does not. There's no situation for him to go to that's just an obvious upgrade from what he has now. And I think with that being the case, he's kind of looking around at it and saying, you know what? I got it pretty good here right now. Like the fans love me. My jersey's going to get retired here. I'm going to break all the franchise records for points and whatever. I might just ride it out here. Like he also, like his family, like he just got married over the summer. He's got, he and his wife they have a son who's about 3 or 4. Then they have twins that were just born earlier this year. So he's got a young family. A lot of his extended family lives out here. His mom, a couple of his cousins, his brother, they all moved out to Portland. They're all kind of entrenched here. I think that he's just kind of looking at this. And again, because of like his perception, Dame, I think the difference between a guy like Dame and a guy like Ben Simmons or a guy like James Harden is I don't think Dame has the stomach to be the bad guy and to have people hate him the way that, like you saw, like the way that James Harden is kind of like the way he kind of handled when, when he wanted to get traded from Houston. How did he, how he handled all that stuff, like showing up out of shape to training camp or like showing up late and like throwing teammates under the bus. That's not Dame. That's never been Dame. That is just not who Dame is. Everything. And I say this as, I've covered Dame for now. I've been back in Portland this is my 5th season back in Portland. Everything, like I've been around players, and I'm not going to name any names, but I've been around some, star players who people's perception of who they are and their personalities and who they are is, kind of a put on, and it's not real and it's not genuine. Or, there's certain guys I've dealt with in Chicago's, even some guys I've dealt with at different times in Portland. Dame is not like that at all. Dame is one of the most real and genuine guys. Like everything you read about, like what a great guy Dame is and just how much he cares about other people and how great of a leader he is and how much his teammates respect him and how he just keeps it real with everybody. And he's somebody that people gravitate to on and off the court. That's all 100% true. That's just who Dame is. And so I don't think he really has it in him to suddenly turn around and be like, get me out of Portland. I'm going to sit out games. I'm going to blow off training camp. I'm going to, throw everybody under the bus. Like that's just not who he is. That's not how he's wired. And so that's because of that. I don't think he's ever going to end up asking out of Portland, even if you maybe were in a position where he might look around and say, yeah, I don't like where this team is on the court. I just don't think he really has that in him to do that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it'll be nice to play fantasy basketball or NBA Live or 2K where you can create your own team and have all
right, exactly
put together like it seems like the league has been doing for the longest now. But I do like the Dame fit in Portland, and I just hope that in which they're able to get more talent to surround them so that way they can really take it to that next level and at least give Dame a chance. But I really do like Dame in Portland, and me personally. Portland would never be the same since they had their big playoff runs with even going back. I was originally thinking, with Scottie Pippen, Sheed, Wallace, Bonzi, those things. But you can even go back even to Brandon Roy. In Portland, when you talk about the success.
And like LaMarcus Aldridge, and just like if Brandon Roy and Greg Oden had been able to stay healthy, like how good would those teams have been? Yeah, absolutely. Like Dame is the guy in terms of like, he is like in terms of like how attached people were to Brandon Roy, and like Dame is like that if Brandon Roy was able to stay healthy for his whole career. That's kind of what Dame is in terms of like just how solid he is as a person and as a leader and just how good he is as a player and just all of that. Like Dame is like the ideal in terms of like on and off the court stuff. He's like the ideal franchise player in terms of everything. Like you'll never find anybody who's ever dealt with Dame or been around Dame or talked to Dame or gotten to know Dame who will ever have a negative thing to say about the guy.
Everybody listening right now, you're listening to Sean Highkin. Sean, maybe I know the time's running a little short on us, which is before we transition to the end of our show, I just wanted your opinion on just briefly what you scoped around the NBA. Who was the teams that, really stood out to you that could really make good positive runs that, quite frankly, maybe at the beginning of the season, you didn't really expect to make this much noise? Like, what was the team for you or a team for you that really stood out to you so far this season?
I got one for you, Cleveland.
Yeah.
And I mean, obviously now, like with the news yesterday or a couple days ago about Evan Mobley being out for a few weeks, but that's not a long-term injury. They said he'll be back in 2 to 4 weeks. So I'm not really that worried about that. But like the combination of him and Lauri Markkanen, who obviously Bulls fans know well and maybe don't have great positive opinions about, and then also Jared Allen, that 3 big lineup was kind of working. And I also like Darius Garland. I mean, obviously losing Colin Sexton for the season or for most of the season is not great, but Darius Garland, I like a lot of what he's brought. And, Ricky Rubio, I think has been a nice fit there. And I think JB Bickerstaff, and I'm really happy for him because he's a guy that has gotten a few interim coach jobs where he hasn't been thrown into a great situation. Like he got the Memphis job when Kevin McHale got fired and like James Harden and Dwight Howard like didn't like each other. And that was like kind of a rough situation. Yeah. He got the Memphis interim job when they fired David Fizdale. And like, it was the end of the Marc Gasol, Mike Conley, like that whole group. And then he got the Cavs job when John Beilein like supposedly accidentally said players were thugs instead of slugs. Remember that whole thing?
Yeah.
And so he kind of gets taken, he takes over these jobs in kind of these not great situations where he isn't really put in a position to succeed. And now he finally has a situation where he has some good young players. I think pretty clearly, even if like, let's say he only misses a couple weeks, I think pretty clearly Evan Mobley is the rookie of the year. He's been incredible so far. Yeah. And they have other good young players. Like they have Darius Garland, they have Jared Allen. They have all these guys. And I think they are maybe like this year's Knicks where, they're not a title team by any means, but they're a team that maybe people didn't think was going to be a playoff team going into the year, but maybe they're a low playoff seed. And now people are looking at Cleveland, which people have kind of thought they were just a joke ever since LeBron left. And they've really never been relevant unless LeBron has been there. Now they're kind of building something. So that's a team I've enjoyed watching. Obviously, the next couple of weeks are going to be kind of rough without Evan Mobley. But if he gets back, and that's not a serious long-term thing, once he gets back, that team I think is still going to be pretty good.
And the other team for me outside of Cleveland, like you mentioned, that really stood out to me was Washington. Now, it's funny how you talk about with the Wizards, Kyle Kuzma coming out and saying pretty much Cleveland was trash until LeBron brought him the championship.
I mean, he's not wrong. He's not wrong. He's not wrong at all. Joakim Noah has said similar things very famously.
Yeah, I mean, Joakim, but it's crazy because Kyle Kuzma just said, like, the team has been trash since LeBron left and came back and all of that. Joakim was just like, the team sucks and your city's trash. I don't even want to come to your city. So that's like a whole other like statement per se. But I think Washington really stood out to me as well, especially when you talk about comparing how Russ is doing with the Lakers right now and the signing of Spencer Dinwiddie in Washington. I think having that lineup with Kuzma, Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, and Harrell as the guys that they brought from that Lakers team really boosted them to that next level. And I'm happy for Wes Unseld Jr. for him to take on.
He's done a good job there. Yeah.
I think that those two teams, especially when you talk about obviously Cleveland for sure, but Washington, considering where they were last year, in that same pool as the Bulls were trying to get that, and they eventually did make the playoffs, but it wasn't.
And here's the other part of the Washington thing that's so crazy: they're winning this much. Bradley Beal has not been good. It's not even just a case of like, oh, this is our superstar carrying us, and he's just so good that he's putting this kind of mediocre collection of role players on his back. And Bradley Beal has not been that good, and they are still winning because they're getting contributions from whether it be Kyle Kuzma or Spencer Dinwiddie or KCP or any of these other guys. Like Jamal Mosley or not Jamal Mosley. That's Orlando. Wes Unseld Jr. He's done a good job.
Yeah, it's just crazy seeing all these different teams that you never really thought would make a good roar, but they are definitely making some noise up in the league. As we get on out of here, Sean, talk just real briefly, what you got coming up next so our followers and our audience can continue to tap into what you got, what you're doing. What you got coming up next for us to pay attention to?
Well, you can always follow my work at Bleacher Report. I think the easiest way to do it, I would say, is to follow me on Twitter at Highkin. And anytime I write something or I'm on a podcast or whatever the case may be, I'll share the link there. That's kind of the easiest thing to do. I have a few things, nothing I can really say publicly, but I have a few things I'm working on right now that I'm pretty excited about that are going to be coming up.
Okay. Yeah, we'll definitely pay attention to those things and looking forward to seeing those new projects and those things coming out. Everybody, you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Josh M. Hicks Media, and you can follow War Media on all platforms, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, you name it. We're all over. You can catch this podcast as well, not just on YouTube, but also on all podcast platforms. We're on Anchor, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, you name it. We're all over the place. And as we wind down, Sean, I want to thank you so much for coming on my show. I really appreciate it. I'm going to continue to follow the work and the things that you do. So continue to do those great things, and hope to keep in touch with you, man. Hopefully, we can see each other eventually in person, whenever that may be.
I am tentatively planning on being in Chicago in May for the Combine.
Okay.
Which is an event that I used to always cover every year before COVID.
Right. Okay.
But I'm tentatively planning on doing that. So yeah, that would be great. No, this was a lot of fun. Keep doing your thing, man. Anything I can ever do to help or whatever, let me know.
Oh, I really appreciate that, for real. You continue to have a good rest of your evening, and wish you the best throughout this NBA season, and keep in touch with you.
Yeah.